The ones who broke you had no idea what was being built. That's the part that costs them. Not the damage, the aftermath. You trusted something real. You gave it without conditions, without a ledger, without a guard posted at the door. And what came back was not equal. What came back was a smile with a blade behind it, words that sounded like care, actions that said otherwise. That's not accident, that's design. And you absorbed it, day after day, season after season. You absorbed it and called it love, called it loyalty, called it connection. But names don't change what a thing actually is.
Poison doesn't stop being poison because someone hands it to you gently. The gentleness is part of the delivery. The warmth is part of the mechanism. You weren't naive. You were targeted. There's a difference, a significant one, and it matters that you understand that. Because what happened to you was not a failure of judgment. It was the result of trusting someone who knew how to weaponize trust. That is a specific kind of damage, quiet, slow, cumulative. Not a single blow, 100 small ones, spread over time, spaced far enough apart that you couldn't name the pattern. Until you could. Until the day clarity arrived, uninvited, undeniable, and everything rearranged. Not with rage, not with noise, with stillness. That's what nobody talks about, the stillness that follows betrayal at depth. Not the screaming phase, not the collapse phase, the phase after that, the phase where the volume drops to zero and what remains is just fact. This happened. This was real. This was deliberate. And now it's done. No revision, no appeal, no going back and arguing with what already occurred. Just done. That moment is the beginning, not the end. The beginning. Most people don't recognize it as that. Most people are still waiting to feel better, still waiting for an apology that isn't coming, still holding space for someone who vacated it a long time ago. The cost of that wait is enormous, more than most people ever calculate. Every day spent anchored to what happened is a day not spent building what comes next.
And what comes next is the part no one planned for. The ones who inflicted the damage, assumptions were made. The damage was assumed permanent. The exit was assumed to become a spiral. The silence was assumed to mean surrender. Silence is not surrender. Silence is a choice made by someone who has nothing left to prove to you. Silence is the sound of someone no longer spending energy on an audience that was never worth it. Silence is preparation. Not visible preparation, not announced preparation. The kind that happens in rooms no one else enters, in hours no one else witnesses. The kind where you strip back everything that doesn't serve what you're building, including the version of yourself that allowed certain things for too long. That version had its reasons. Respect those reasons, but don't carry that version forward. It was built for conditions that no longer exist.
What you build now gets built on different materials. Not hope, not trust extended without evidence, not the assumption that people want good things for you by default. No. What you build now gets built on what you've actually confirmed, what you've lived through, what you've tested and found true. That is not bitterness. Bitterness holds on. Bitterness stays in the same orbit as what hurt it. Bitterness needs the wound to stay fresh to justify itself. What you're doing is not that. What you're doing is updating, based on evidence, based on outcome, based on the actual results of actual experience. That is not a collapse of character. That is character maturing past the point where it can be exploited.
The version of you that existed before knew how to give, genuinely, without performance, without expectation of return that you couldn't let go of when it didn't come. That capacity is not the problem. That capacity is rare, and it will remain rare in you, but it will no longer be available to everyone. That is the shift, not the death of who you were, the precision of who you're becoming. The same quality, half the radius. Only the ones who've earned access, only the ones who've demonstrated, not declared, what matters. No more extending benefit of the doubt indefinitely. No more interpreting absence of evidence as evidence of safety. Evidence is the currency now, and the standards are non-negotiable.
The betrayal was a curriculum. Not one you signed up for, not one you would have chosen, but the content was real, and the education was thorough. You learned what exploitation actually feels like from the inside. You learned how it's packaged, how it presents, what language it uses, what it asks for first, what it takes next. That knowledge cannot be purchased, cannot be downloaded, cannot be taught in a classroom. It can only be acquired through contact. You made contact. You survived contact. You now carry what contact teaches. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is, in the most direct sense, an edge. An edge over every version of yourself that hasn't been tested. An edge over people who've never been forced past their own softness. Not superiority, edge. The awareness that comes from being broken and refusing to stay broken. From choosing at some point in the process not to let what happened define the ceiling. From deciding without dramatics, without announcement, that the story continues and that the next chapter gets written differently. Not reactively, not as a response to what happened, deliberately, on terms that you set, with clarity that you earned.
Isolation gets misread. The assumption is damage. The assumption is that withdrawal equals loss. That assumption is often wrong. Some withdrawals are not retreats. Some are recalibrations. A complete stop, a full inventory, a full accounting of everything that was allowed in, everything that was accepted without question, everything that drained without replenishing, and then a restructuring, not of the world, of the self, the standards, the access, the time, the energy, the focus, all of it examined, all of it reorganized around what actually matters, what actually moves the needle, what actually builds something worth having. That process cannot happen with an audience. It cannot happen while performing okayness. It cannot happen while still managing other people's comfort about your condition. At some point, the performance has to stop. Not because the performance was wrong to begin with, because it costs too much. Every bit of energy used to seem fine is energy not used to actually get there. And fine is not the destination. Fine is a holding pattern, a waiting room, a place you sit in until something changes. But things don't change in waiting rooms. Things change in the dark, in the work, in the hours where no one is watching and you do it anyway. That is where the gap gets built. Not the gap between you and whoever hurt you, the gap between who you were and who you're becoming. That gap is the only one worth measuring. Scars are not decorations, not proof of suffering, not status, not something to display or perform around. Scars are data, record of where the structure was tested, record of where the structure held or didn't, record of where the rebuild was necessary.
And every rebuild, done deliberately, produces something stronger at the point of failure. That's not a figure of speech. That is how the process works. The version of you that went through the worst of it and came out the other side making different decisions, that version was built at the point of failure, at the exact location of the damage. You didn't recover despite what happened. You built because of what happened. The material was the experience. The result was you.
And the return. Not the return to what was. Not the return to the version of the world that allowed the damage. The return as a different thing entirely. Unrecognizable in some ways, familiar in others. But the familiarity is surface, the depth is different. Because the depth was rebuilt in conditions that produced precision, not comfort, not ease, not the warmth of people telling you what you wanted to hear. Precision. The kind that comes from operating alone, from learning what you can actually do when no one is watching, from discovering that the floor you thought existed was not the floor at all, that there was further down, and you survived further down.
Which means the ceiling is also not where you thought it was. That's the exchange. You find out how low it can go. You find out how high it can go. Both in the same process, both through the same trial. The people who never hit the floor don't know the ceiling either. Operating in the middle, comfortable, predictable, contained. Nothing wrong with that, but that's not the path you're on. Your path went through the floor, which means the ceiling is open in a way theirs is not. Use that, not as revenge, not as proof to someone who stopped caring. Use it for yourself, for the life that gets built after this, for the version of your own potential that had to wait while the damage was being processed. It was waiting. It is still waiting. The processing is almost done.
The discipline that came out of this is not abstract. It shows up in decisions, in what gets accepted and what doesn't, in what gets tolerated and what gets cut, in how time gets spent, in what receives focus. Discipline is not mood, not feeling, not a state you achieve and then maintain effortlessly. It is a series of choices made in sequence, made when the choice is inconvenient, made when the alternative is more comfortable, made because the destination requires them. And you know the destination now in a way you didn't before. Because you know the alternative, you've lived the alternative, you know what it costs. That knowledge changes the calculus.
Not everyone who goes through what you went through comes out this way. Some people make it to the other side and carry the wound as identity, define themselves by what was done to them, organize their entire life around the story of the damage. And the story gets told and retold, and the wound never closes, because closing it would mean losing the identity. That's a trap, a real one, a painful one to witness, and a dangerous one to fall into. What happened to you is part of the story. It is not the whole story. It is not even the most important part. The most important part is what comes next, what you build in the aftermath, how completely you refuse to let the damage be the final word.
Because the final word isn't theirs. It was never theirs. The damage was theirs. The aftermath is yours. Every day past the point of betrayal is a day in territory no one else controls. A day where the decisions are yours, where the direction is yours. Something was ended. You decide what starts. That asymmetry matters. The one who breaks something does not get to determine what gets built from the pieces. That belongs to the builder. And you are the builder here. Not the victim of the break, not the keeper of the wound. The builder, with materials no one knew were being handed over.
So here is what happens next. Not in the abstract, in practice. Every day from this point, the work gets done. Not because the feeling is right, not because the mood arrived, not because conditions are perfect, because the work gets done regardless. Because the gap only grows through accumulation, day after day of choices made in the right direction, none of them dramatic, all of them necessary. The feeling follows the action, not the other way around. Waiting to feel ready is waiting to lose.
Coming back transformed doesn't happen on emotion. It happens on preparation, on time spent in the work when no one was validating it, on standards maintained in private when no one was checking. That's the separation. Not talent, not circumstances, not the presence or absence of support. What you did in the dark, what you chose in the absence of recognition, what you built when the only audience was you. That's the separation. And that separation has been growing. From the moment clarity arrived, from the moment the noise went quiet, from the moment the decision got made somewhere under everything that this is not the end. It's been growing, and it keeps growing. Every single day that you work when it's hard, every single night that you rest without guilt, every boundary held without apology, every bad option declined without drama. All of it accumulates, all of it builds.
There's a particular kind of danger in telling the story too often, even to yourself. Every time the story gets replayed in detail, who did what, when, how it landed, the wound gets reopened, not healed, reopened. And an open wound is not useful, not a badge, not proof, just an open wound. Close it, not by pretending it didn't happen, not by forgiving on a timeline that doesn't fit, not by performing healing that hasn't actually occurred, by stopping the replay, by letting the event exist as a closed chapter, done, real, over, without needing to revisit it to inventory the loss. You know what was lost, no further review required.
Running through the list of everything taken, everything broken, everything that was trusted and shouldn't have been. The list doesn't shrink through repetition. The list grows. Because the mind under stress finds more to add, more evidence, more instances, more confirmation of the original wound. Until the list is all there is, until the wound is the entire room. That's not processing. That's inhabiting. Processing moves. Inhabiting stays. Processing extracts what's useful and continues forward. Inhabiting makes a home in the ruins. The ruins are not the destination.
The extraction is the skill. Pulling from pain what strengthens, leaving behind what corrodes. The experience contains both. The part that strengthens, clarity. The part that corrodes, bitterness. Both are available. Both will grow if fed. What gets fed is a choice. Not always a conscious one, not always an easy one, but always a choice. And that choice compounds. Feed the clarity, decisions improve, standards sharpen, direction solidifies, the work becomes more targeted. Feed the bitterness, the radius of damage expands. New relationships get infected with old wounds. New opportunities get filtered through old failures. The past starts running the present. That is the extended trap, the one set by the original event that keeps catching new things long after the event is over. Stop letting it catch. The version being built in the aftermath operates differently. Not louder, not more defended, not harder in a way that breaks things, harder in a way that holds.
the hardness that comes from having been soft in the wrong places and paying for it, and then making specific adjustments. Not closing off entirely, closing off precisely. Because most people operate at one of two extremes: fully open, fully available, no discrimination, or fully closed, nothing in, nothing out. The precision lives between those extremes: selective, calibrated, aware. Available to what earns access, closed to what hasn't earned it. That is not coldness. That is not damage wearing the mask of strength. That is accurate calibration based on real information.
And what it produces over time is a different relationship with trust. Not the absence of trust, not unlimited trust extended to anyone who presents well. Earned trust. Trust built on a track record, confirmed through consistency observed over time. Not granted at the point of charm, not extended on the basis of good presentation. Built slowly, confirmed repeatedly. That approach takes longer, fewer quick connections, fewer fast bonds. But what it produces is real. And real holds when pressure arrives. Real does not disappear when it's no longer convenient. That's the standard now.
The silence that followed the betrayal was not empty. It only appeared empty from the outside. From the outside, withdrawal reads as damage. Absence reads as defeat. Quiet reads as surrender. Let it read that way. Let the assumptions stand. Because the assumptions being wrong is part of what makes the return land differently. The ones who wrote off the silence as loss, who called the absence a disappearance, who misread preparation as giving up, those are the ones who haven't built anything comparable. The gap, the quiet, the dark work, none of it was visible. All of it was accumulating. And what was accumulated cannot be faked, cannot be rushed, cannot be bought at any price. It can only be built in exactly the conditions you've been in. That is the thing worth understanding, not as a consolation, as a fact. The conditions that felt like punishment were production. Every day of uncertainty, production. Every hour of doubt, production. Every moment of sitting with discomfort instead of running from it, production. The output doesn't show up on the day of the input. That's the part most people can't tolerate. The delay between the effort and the evidence. The gap where nothing visible is happening but everything important is. Most people exit during the gap. Go back to the comfortable. Go back to the familiar. Go back to the version of themselves that doesn't require this much. But the gap is where the separation happens. Staying in the gap, continuing in the gap, building in the gap, that is what produces an outcome no one can contest. Not because anyone was watching, because the work was real. The work always shows eventually. In the decisions, in the responses, in the standards held without announcement, it shows. That's the standard now. This is the work. Not a speech, not a realization, not a single powerful moment. The daily accumulation of small, correct decisions. That is what transformation actually is. That is what power actually is. Not a destination you arrive at, a direction you maintain. Maintain the direction. One more day, then the next one, then the one after that. The compounding does the rest. You already survived the worst of it. The rest is just the work. Cut everything that doesn't serve the build. Add nothing that isn't earned. Hold the standard regardless of how it feels. Get back to it.